Shall we start?
Yes, please.
Okay. Um, thank you, Jason, for suggesting this. Today we're going to talk about conscious awareness, a little bit of philosophy, some functional psychology, and some neuroscience related to the problem. And I have for today's agenda a slide of topics that I suppose some of it's aspirational. We'll see how far we get, but we should be able to get through most of the core issues. And we're first going to talk about the philosophy of the mind-body problem and how it pertains to this question of the neural basis of awareness. And then the psychology. How do we think about minds in terms of their functions and structure, the structure of minds, in the sense of information processing in brains? And then the neuroscience. What are the specific neural requirements that are needed to produce awareness, and then the contents of specific contents of awareness? So, and then there are some outstanding issues that torment me. I don't know if we're going to get to them, but we can if you guys are interested. So I built in some stopping points after each section, and I think that they'll be brief, maybe 6 or 10 minutes. But just so we can ask clarifying questions, and also so we can get through most of this, maybe everything but the outstanding issues. So who am I? I come from another planet. I started out interested in, I did my work in theoretical biology. I've researched and written in cybernetics and systems theory. I was in a systems science department as a graduate student. I became an auditory neuroscientist around 1990 and worked on the neural coding of pitch and rhythm. So what are the neural correlates at the level of the auditory nerve of what we hear in music? I've also worked in theoretical neuroscience, proposed temporal time domain models of brain function, and I've been in and out, sort of on the periphery of the consciousness studies scene for 25 years. I presented at conferences. This is of the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness, which is one of the main groups pushing on the problem. Another one is centered at Tucson. And I published papers that are related to neural coding and conscious awareness. But the main thing is several years ago, I was lucky and privileged to be able to design a course and teach it at the Boston Conservatory on basically an introduction to consciousness studies for undergraduates. And these are performers, these are musicians, dancers, and actors. So I wanted to make the course accessible to them and useful to them in their lives as a way of understanding kind of the basic terrain of psychology, their own psychology, their own experience, and hopefully relevant to their needs as performers. So we went through and we did sort of the basics of philosophy and psychology and neuroscience, but also some topics related to things like meditation and mental imagery, mental rehearsal, and flow states, that are relevant for performers. So, and there are some supplemental materials that I would advise anyone who's interested in the subject, who wants an introduction to these things, to look at. So we're going to start the first segment, philosophy, which I take as the study of ideas. It's really a conceptual toolbox, in my view. It's at least as important to science as mathematics. What is consciousness? What are we talking about? There are all these definitions and conceptions of word consciousness out there. We'll look at a few, but we're going to focus on conscious awareness, first-person experience, awake and aware, sometimes called the view from within, and what Ned Block calls phenomenal consciousness. And so the mind-body problem, in today's terminology, it's sort of a misnomer, but it's the philosophical problem between physical process or the body, including the brain and the nervous system, and conscious awareness, the mind in the old terminology, or subjective experience in our terminology. And John Searle, there's a YouTube video that's worth watching, says that it's the subjective difference from being deep asleep, in a dreamless sleep, and awake. And there are features of our waking experience. And he thinks that they're real and irreducible. They have a qualitative character. They're private. I don't know what you're feeling directly. I have to infer that from your behavior, but and your appearance. But I know that I have my own subjective experience. So each one of us can interrogate our private experiences. Another favorite philosopher of mine is Ned Block, who's, I think, one of the clearest thinkers in the philosophical topic. He also maintains that consciousness is not an illusion. The hard problem of Chalmers is really not a problem. I think it's a question of existence, and so it's sort of a pseudo problem. It really cannot be answered by science, and you shouldn't ask science to answer, say, why is there gravity in the first place? It's sort of meaningless. But there is a problem of other minds. Which animals do we think have conscious awareness or creature consciousness in the way that we do? How far down the phyletic tree do we think that goes? And it turns out it seems to go very, very far to maybe all animals and including octopuses. So Ned Block also makes the distinction between phenomenal versus access consciousness. Phenomenal awareness being experiencing a red or green qualia, and that you're experiencing it, and access consciousness being access to information without really having the feeling that you are aware of it. So there are people with blind sight, usually parietal lesions, and they don't see, they're not aware of anything in the affected hemifield, be over on the other side. But if pressed, they can guess and point to moving objects in that hemifield that they can't see. So just as a warning, there are different senses of consciousness. We're going to be focused on awareness, but there are these uses of the word as informational function, of self-consciousness, which usually comes out of a Platonic or Hegelian ontology. Collective consciousness, where you have consciousness on the social level, like George Herbert Mead, or strong and activist externalistic conceptions, often stemming from Ryle and others, extreme behaviorists who don't like the idea of mentalism, looking under the hood at what's going on in the mind and brain at all. And they reject conscious awareness. They're the ones who think that it doesn't exist, or that it's not worth talking about because it can't be described in physical terms. So the major ontologies we're going to just keep in mind are unlimited materialism, physics explains everything. Current physics explains everything, and there's nothing worth talking about outside the physical processes, and everything should be reduced to physical process. There's also the Cartesian tradition of substance dualism, where you have two separate substances, matter and spirit, or matter and mind in that sense of mind. That's been with us since Descartes, and there's mutual causation. There's Platonism, where everything is form. That's attractive to people inclined towards mathematics and other domains where they can bring a whole virtual world into being. And it's the notion that the world is inherently mathematical, and mathematics reveals the true structure of the world. And many higher order theories of consciousness, and the idea that recursive programs might be conscious, would be Platonic approaches. Many people believe in a spiritual world, or a God that encompasses the universe. There's also solipsism, some extreme varieties of phenomenalism deny materiality altogether, as did Bishop Lord Berkeley. And the ontology that is my working ontology is that there's one substance, a material substrate, if you will, that produces, that can be described in different ways. There are as many ways to describe it as you choose. There are as many observables as you can make measuring devices for. And we can describe it in terms of physical observables or functional observables, which involve some sort of performance measure, or phenomenal observables that are related to what qualia, what feelings people report. So in this view, it's a hylomorphic view, and unfortunately, there are no good books that I know of on a modernized hylomorphism, but that's the Aristotelian idea that organization, form, and functional organization are embedded in matter, and therefore those things are, you need matter to have those things, but they are separate aspects. So different organizations of matter can have different properties, and what defines life, as an autopoietic system, let's say, is its organization and the organization of production of components. What defines purpose, in my view, is whether you have cybernetic structures, steering structures that steer the system towards achieving certain goals. And likewise, what defines or what enables systems to have awareness is a certain kind of organization of informational processes. I'll try to make clear what I mean by informational in that context. So this slide basically says the same thing. You can have multiplicities of complementary kinds of descriptions in a non-reductionistic materialism. We're going to use the word phenomenal. Here we're here in Boston. That's often equated with wicked awesome, but it's come to refer to that which is directly experienced, and we're going to use it that way. And when we're talking to undergrads about philosophy, I tried to do a little bit of education about critical thinking, and part of what I think is important is knowing why you believe something. Why you believe what you believe. What are the grounds for your belief? and also whether the questions being asked and the answers that are being expected are congruent, whether the question itself is well posed and meaningful. So, and are there alternative explanations? Usually there are. It's not usually one thing or another. So in Cartesian dualism, which is a favorite whipping boy nowadays, and I don't think many people outside of, say, religious belief really believe in it. Neuroscientists do not believe in Cartesian dualism, that there's a place in the brain where the brain and some spiritual realm are interacting. But in Cartesian dualism, there's matter, substance A, and mind stuff, substance B, and they are causing each other. You could also have a dual aspect monism, where you have physical attributes and descriptions and phenomenal subjective attributes. But I think that also leaves out the whole realm of functional attributes, which are different from physical attributes. A model of a thermostat is a different kind of model than a model of the physics of the parts of the thermostat, and they predict different things, and they say different things about the system. A functional model of the thermostat tells you, it's kind of a block diagram of how you could build one, irrespective of the parts. The physical model is all about the motions of the parts. And likewise, a model that's predicting phenomenal attributes is a qualitatively different kind than a functional model. Now, I distinguish between non-informational functions and informational mental functions, and I've written chapters and papers on a system semiotics of natural and artificial systems, where informational here means that one can effectively describe a system in terms of its behavior being switched by distinctions. Like if I shout to you, stop, that's going to switch your behavior, hopefully. And we can describe it in terms of that you would have to recognize the category of recognizing the word stop and what that means for you, and possibly also inferring what it might mean for me. But that's different from say, a model of the heart. How well does it pump blood? Where you have in both cases you have performance measures, but the nature of the models are different. So there are major features of conscious awareness. It has structure. Our experience has structure. And the typical list of Searle and others is that it has a binary character, either you have it or not. There's a unity of awareness. One me at every time. There may be, if you have multiple personality disorders, they might be alternating, but at any one time there's one. There's a stream of awareness. There are changes which can be just continuous or discrete. There's the contents of our experience with different combinations of feelings, sensations, thoughts, and desires we have at any one moment. And that can remain constant or change as a sense of time passing, of situatedness in space, of self and non-self. What are the boundaries of your body? In class, we did the rubber hand illusion, where you can set things up so it appears that this rubber hand on the table in front of you is part of your body, so that when someone gets a hammer and hammers at it, you jump. That's a lot of fun. So there's also a feeling of will, self-direction, control over one's mind. An important aspect of this is that we're not aware of most events in the world that we know are happening because others observe them, or in our bodies and nervous systems. And so most of what we experience is a small fraction of the things that are going on. We'll get to this in a minute. There are also levels of awareness. The neurologists need a scale of levels of awareness, going from total anesthesia, general anesthesia, deep anesthesia, and coma to full awareness. And a way of thinking about that is how many distinctions can be kept in mind in each of these states. And Tononi's informational complexity measure, which we're going to talk about down the pike, is roughly based on the number of distinctions a given state can support. So the vast majority of stuff that's going on does not result in changes in our awareness. And also importantly, there are multiple nervous states that will generate the same experience. I worked on pitch, and there you can change a stimulus ever so slightly in various ways, like change the phase of some resolved components, and you don't notice it at all. So there's an isomorphism between the things that are going on in the nervous system and our awareness of that. But it appears that only events that are registered in patterns of neural activity have any effect on our awareness. I don't know of any evidence that points otherwise. So that's the working hypothesis. But only a subset of neural activity does change the contents of our awareness. So why is that? And what is the essential difference between neural activity that changes awareness, supraliminal events, versus neural activity that doesn't, subliminal events? So there are two problems related to that. And this is known as the neural correlates of consciousness. I think Christoph Koch may have coined that term in the 1990s. So which types of neural activities correlate with the presence or absence of awareness? And the working assumption is there's no awareness without specific types of patterns of neuronal activity. And what differentiates, the neuroscientists know that what differentiates absence of awareness from normal waking states is not a complete lack of neuronal activity. The neurons are always spontaneously firing, the vast majority of them, but of different patterns of activity. And the evidentiary basis of this is you have a complete loss of awareness during general anesthesia, absence seizures, deep stages of sleep, coma, and there can also be hypnosis and all other altered states where one is just unaware of time passing or what's going on around you. So this is the neural correlates of modal states of consciousness. There are also neural correlates, separate neural correlates of the contents of consciousness. Whether you're seeing a blue square or a red circle or a green triangle, whether you're tasting something that's sweet or bitter or sour. So which specific neuronal activities are correlated with changes in subjective experience? So what changes in neural activity change the contents of our consciousness, change our experiences? That's the problem of the neural coding of pitch in a nutshell. What are the differences in the nervous system that make a difference, either in the functions that we can carry out or in our awareness? So the evidentiary basis for that are that we know very well if we change sensory stimuli, that's going to change neural responses, and that's going to change subjective sensations that are going to be reported. Also, there are masking experiments where you take two stimuli and in a conflicting situation, and you can adjust the stimuli so that half the time the subject will see the stimuli or hear the stimulus, and the other time they won't. And you can look at the changes in the neural responses for when they are aware versus when they're not. So, and we'll talk about some of those. And the short of it is that the basic current theories, and I haven't been to a conference in a while, so I may not be up to the very most recent things, but the current theories are that activation of global circuits is necessary. People used to talk about fame in the brain, how many neurons are being activated, but it's also which patterns of neurons are being activated, perhaps, and maybe whether the brain is regenerating the patterns of activity that are related to some difference or distinction. So what we seek are predictive empirical scientific models of consciousness, states of consciousness and their contents. And these are neurophenomenal bridge laws, because they're bridge laws because they predict one kind of observable from another. And the kinds of observable that we are looking for are observables related to modes of neural activity to predict then states of awareness. And for NCCCs, CCCCs, too many C's, there are models that predict specific contents of consciousness. So we are interested in what are the specific patterns of neuronal activity that give rise to experiential differences. And these differences can be differences in sensations, perceptions, cognitions, emotions, desires, memories, all the aspects of experience. Below are two depictions of different olfactory experiences, some pleasant, some not. We're getting almost to a stopping point. So we have the illusion, I don't want to call it an illusion, we have the sense that our waking awareness is what's driving everything, and that we come to some decision in our waking awareness to do something, and then we do it. But there have been studies that show that there are processes going in the brain, as evidenced by readiness potentials, that occur, say, 200 milliseconds before we decide to act. And there could be changes. We can decide that we're going to act, and then something can happen and we don't do what we expected to do, we would do. And the reason for this, so I'm an epiphenomenalist. I know it's a loaded word and I use it advisedly, but I think that the physical world is closed under physical process, but our experiences are generated by the neural substrates. But our experiences are correlated with what's going on in the nervous system. It's an isomorphic relation, but it's correlated. Because it's correlated, normally it seems that we are experiencing our desire to move, and then we experience the movement and the effects of the movement. So it appears that things are causal with respect to our experiences, but because they are correlated with processes that are causal, that is sort of an illusion. It's correlation with a common cause. We can get into that more at the end. Now, the global workspace theories, just to telegraph ahead, postulate that recurrent neuronal activity is necessary for neural signals to become part of our conscious awareness, to have an effect on it. Global circuits stabilize local circuits and regenerate neural signals and integrate them. And a way of thinking about that is that global workspaces are in essence short-term reverberating memories, where the current contents of awareness and what we're going to operate on are held in a dynamic memory. So here we are at a stopping point. Oh, there are some slides about what I think. I think we're going to skip those. We can come back to it just so that there are no misunderstandings. I'm not an eliminativist epiphenomenalist. I believe that subjective experience is as real, in quotes, as anything else. It exists, but we only know the form of our own subjective experience. So here we are, and I'll take any questions or comments, clarification.
You mentioned the rubber hand experiment.
Yes.
I was very much impressed by the fact that the rubber hands, once established the relationship with the brain, can feel pain. So the subject will say, ouch, if you hit the rubber hand with a hammer. But in the same time, in the rear, for the rear hand, outside of the subject, they put in a pin into that rear hand, and there is no feeling at all. So, so what was the explanation of those people doing the experiment? Well, what happened?
We're getting extraneous audio. Please mute your mics.
Oh, okay. What happened, at least the experimenting people, how do they explain at a micro level what's really going on inside that brain? Like they can totally fabric a pain feeling, and in the same time can totally ignore a real pain of the inserting a pin into the rear hand.
Yes.
So one is completely shut down, the other is totally fabricated.
Well, if your attention is on the rubber hand, I mean, there are several answers to this. One is that you can have selective attention. And maybe we know about the film with the gorilla and the basketballs being passed around. And if you're not attending to the whole scene, and you're focused on the basketball, you ignore the gorilla and it doesn't even come into your awareness. In the case of the rubber hand, there are correlated events that are occurring. You're seeing the hand being stroked usually, and you feel your own hand being stroked. And so when you have a correlation, multimodal correlations, there's a strong feeling that you're going to group all those together. And when we come to percept action loops, I'll give you an explanation in terms of loci of control. When we wield a stick, or a pen in this case, and poke things, the functional end of our body is the end of the stick, not where the stick encounters our hand. So, and that's because the motions at the end of the stick are what's contingent. So there are these realms of contingency, both of sensation and action, that we could call epistemic cuts and control cuts, that demarcate a realm of internal causation, self-caused activity, and the external world outside of that. They're basically functional boundaries. So I'll talk a little bit about it when we get to it. The issues
I have two raised hand, Jamie and Bird.
All right, my question, and I'm just throwing that out there. So in your general introduction, I heard you kind of introducing, but maybe not saying explicitly, but it definitely was there implicitly, that there is like the overall background, like the cosmology, and then there is the specific research question that is being asked. And so a question that I'm curious how much that question is integrated. Like when does consciousness emerge in the womb? Dus at which moment does one decide how the fetus is conscious, and how is that question explicitly addressed or just kind of implicitly? And I'm notice.
Well,
sorry.
So
how
let me answer that question. It's a problem of other minds. It's the same problem as
Yeah.
the problems of whether animals have awareness.
But it's also Peter. But can I say it's also the problem of your mind and my mind, because it's about how the mind of the researcher came in existence. So that is
yes, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
But I believe that you have a similar awareness to mine because both of the similarity of structure of our nervous systems and correlations between my internal states as I observe them and my behaviors as I know others observe them. So I infer, it's easier to infer that you are conscious in the way that, and aware in the way that I am, than it is to infer, the further out you get from the adult waking state, the harder it is to make assertions about that. And I think the only way to proceed is to study systems, awake adults whose states we are clear on, and then develop a theory, a predictive theory of what predicts those states, whether it's which neurons are firing or how they're firing, or whether there are global workspaces that have been ignited. Then once we have that kind of theory, we can start applying it to infants and animals and even machines to determine, according to the theory, whether we would expect that system to have awareness. So there is a methodology for dealing with that. I think, in some ways, it's better to start where the phenomena are clear and make models for that, and then extend outwards to deal with borderline or ambiguous situations. So that would be my strategy. I'd like to move on if I could.
Bert has a question.
Get through this. Is there someone else with a question?
Yes, I have a question which goes a little bit in the other direction, back to philosophy, because I'm in a way possibly missing a philosophy which could give very good answers, perhaps. You mentioned in the beginning, we need matter on the one hand, and on the other hand, we can, as you said, we can describe it in very different ways. I agree with both statements, and to me they sound very much like radical constructivism. And I wonder how you see radical constructivism, a philosophy which I appreciate very much and which to me provides many answers to intricate questions.
Yeah. Well, yes, I consider myself a radical constructivist, and in the sense of von Glasersfeld. He's a Kantian and a constructivist, and I'm also a Piagetian psychological constructivist as well, and a mathematical constructivist in the realm of proof. So yes.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Okay, onwards. So psychology. And what I tried to do is to give my students kind of a basic theory of psychology. Again, we're dealing with consciousness as a subjective experience, and that's the realm of introspective psychology and phenomenology. Some phenomenologies are closer to psychology and introspection than others. Mind is the informational organization of brain. and mental processes or informational processes in brains that control behavior. They switch behavior. And brains are, of course, networks of specialized cells that send signals to each other to coordinate behavior. Now, so there are differences between psychology and neuroscience. Psychology is focused on functions largely, and neuroscience is focused on structure. So there's sort of a structure-function dichotomy. Most neuroscientists don't deal with information per se or function per se. Mostly they're looking at the structure of the system and the behaviors of the system rather than trying to come up with functional models, or what we'll call reverse engineering the system. So available to us, we have our own, we can introspect, and they're private observables. I can listen to a sound or look at an image and reflect on what I feel when I see those things. There's behavior, public third-person observables, where we're looking at the actions of subjects in naturalistic settings or in controlled settings, as in experimental psychology, like pressing a button. Press button A if the two stimuli are the same, or button B if they're not. And there can be physiological observations. We can measure neural activity via EEG or MEG or fMRI, or in animals or people awaiting neurosurgery, we can look at single neurons. There are other physiological measures, non-neural measures, and molecular measures. These are the kinds of observables that we have available to us. There are major conscious states. These, I believe, they reflect modes of neural signal processing. And the contents reflect the particular compositions of neural signals in short-term memory. And my hypothesis is that these are the signals that are being actively regenerated by the system. But the major states of consciousness, go from high arousal states, waking states, versus low arousal states. And then below that, you have minimally conscious states, seizures, during absence seizures, general anesthesia, coma, and even death. Where we presume there's a complete lack of awareness. There are basic aspects of our minds, sensations and perceptions, cognitions, emotions, desires, drives, actions. We experience actions indirectly through the sensation changes that they enact, and also what feelings they can change. And we also have memories. So some elements of our subjective experience are these: sensations, emotions, desires, purposes, thoughts, memories, imaginations, our sense of our body position, pleasure and pain, intuitions, any mystical experiences that we might have that we can't describe very well, time, space, and a feeling of self and non-self. And there are others as well. We're not going to go through this, but there are sense modalities. And these are the dimensions of our sensory experience, sensory and perceptual experience. So in a visual scene, there are different attributes. In an auditory scene, any auditory event is going to have a set of different dimensions and different values of those dimensions, or different states in those dimensions, like a pitch at 440 versus 256 hertz, two different notes on the piano. Even emotional space has structure. So this is a structuralist framework for psychological function. tried to come up with my own orthogonal dimensions of emotional space. This is probably not exhaustive, you know, but it gets a large part of what emotions we can feel. So the high level organization of animal minds and brains, these informational functions are going to be in the context of a cybernetic goal-seeking system. Through evolution, organisms evolve mechanisms that enhance their survival, reproduction, next generation. They evolve to coordinate behavior of motile animals. They coordinate they self-regulate, and they also orchestrate externalized action. So animals have nervous systems, in my opinion, because nervous systems choose and coordinate appropriate actions. Animals don't make their own food. They have to move around by and large, unless they're filter feeders. And their surrounds are always changing. So they're embedded in these percept coordination action cycles. And they have sensory receptors and motor effectors that register changes in the joint state of the measuring device and the environment, which, if the measuring device is stable, then it's changes in the environment. The joint state is going to reflect that. So there's an uncertainty reduction vis-a-vis the environment at the point of contingency, which is the epistemic cut. And likewise, they have motor effectors that make changes in the external environment. When you put a prosthesis between the sensory receptors, you know, like these glasses or like a stick, you're extending that point of contingency outwards. So there's a realm of internal control within the organism, within the nervous system usually, but within the organism, and a realm of uncontrolled events. And that plane of contingency, if you will, is correlated with our feelings of self. Now, all of these functionalities in this very abstract diagram have correlates. They have correspondences and analogs in brains and nervous systems. So if we look again, you know, we have the percept action loop. But behavior is not just reactive. Perception and action is not sufficient to tell you, to predict what an animal is going to do. These are also systems in which you have internal goals. So the percept action systems act on the basis of the perceived state of the world. Purposive systems act on the basis of internal goals and current needs and drives. Mnemonic systems retain memory of past sequences of events to predict future behavior, the outcomes of prospective actions, and so guide prospective behavior. And finally, adaptive systems are purposive systems that reorganize themselves to better achieve internal goals. So in addition to the percept action loop, in the coordinative part, if we unpack that and unfold that, there are also goals. And there are means of evaluating the current state of goal satisfaction, you know, whether our blood sugar level is adequate, whether we're oxygenating our blood adequately. And so we can evaluate the current state of the body and the environment and steer behavior so as to focus on those actions that will satisfy or achieve or better achieve those goals. So the goal systems modify the actions that are chosen in a given perceived situation. And so organisms are purposive systems. The goals can be very basic, self-maintenance and survival, or they can be more complicated or even more long-range than that. And there's the Maslow hierarchy of needs. In addition, animals are memory systems, they're mnemonic systems. And in general, there are short-term, really short-term sensory, or what's called echoic memory in the auditory system. I'm going to use short-term memory as a generic for labile memory that encompasses everything that's not, should we say, hard-coded or durable. But there are two kinds of memory, one of them being what many of us assume are reverberating patterns of neural activity that can be disrupted by anesthetics or sleep cycles. And they can last for minutes or hours even. And then there's long-term memory, where memory traces are stored in some more durable form. Could be molecular, or it could be synaptic changes. I have views on that, but we're not going to get into it here. And memory ends up, memory ends up also changing which goals we pursue. If one goal seems unattainable to us, or it seems that some course of action brought us pain and suffering in the past, like if you're a dog and you mess with a skunk, then the next time you see a skunk, that's going to activate those long-term memories, and you're going to be biased against messing with it again. So if we want to predict behavior, we need not only external contextual factors like the current perceived state of the environment, and what available possibilities for action are at hand, and what disincentives and disincentives are at hand, but internal states of mind, what mode we're in, whether we're sleeping or waking. We're not going to respond at all if we're sleeping, and whether we're in a stereotype behavioral mode or a given emotional state, which can bias what actions we take, what goals are currently in play. So there are internal factors that also need to be taken into account if we're going to have a model of predicting behavior. So my list of sort of major types of mental functionalities, each of these has a neural correlate. There are systems in the brain that we can point to that achieve these basic functions. And it can be complicated, but if we're going to understand things, we need to have intelligible frameworks for thinking about them. So there are reward systems in the brain that help us decide between competing goals, the interface with memory, and these tend to be in the frontal, prefrontal cerebral cortex, and there are switching mechanisms, circuits that populations that switch behavior, that suppress certain circuits for particular behaviors and facilitate others. Their sensory and motor cortex for analyzing incoming sensory information, for organizing it, and for directing actions, and sensory motor pathways. So my kind of cartoon diagram of that is that usually there are circular causal processes, there are loops. And the brain is, I think of the brain in terms of a network of recurrent processes. And they're integrated via some sort of regenerative short-term memory, or I would use the word working memory, but some psychologists have very specific connotations of that. So we'll say it's regenerative short-term memory, in which elements from items from long-term memory can come into play, cognitive dynamics, goal competitions, emotional dynamics, the inputs from our sensory systems, both on the external world and on our bodies. That contents of our present awareness are what steer our behaviors. The contents, the signal contents, which neuronal activity patterns are actively being regenerated within that loop, which we will call a neural global workspace down the pike. The contents of that, I believe, are isomorphic with the contents of our experience. So that will be the main message. So we'll stop again for a few minutes. I'll take questions, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of what we think are the actual neural correlates of conscious awareness. We probably won't have time to get into any detail on the neural correlates of the contents of consciousness, because that involves a neural coding problem. But I'm happy to talk about that if we have time. So questions?
Peter, when you use the word memory, are you using it in the sense of storage?
Yes, there's some state of the system that is being put into a form that is time invariant, that persists over time, such that it can be recalled or accessed to give a readout of past events. It's time shifting. It's time shifting of an informational distinction. Does that help? There's genetic memory. Paty, my mentor, Howard Paty, basically DNA is a genetic memory. It's stored in the most stable molecule in the organism, and it can be put in, and then it becomes time invariant. It doesn't matter how much time passes until you retrieve that memory.
Bernd?
Yeah.
Yes, I very much agree with what you described, but there is a little point. You often use the word correlates, isomorphic. I see it the same way, but the so-called hard problem is, how do you get from one side of the isomorphic to the other side? How do you get from the correlate to the other thing? And
Well,
there, I think, just two more sentences. There, I think the issue is a change of perspective between first person perspective and second person perspective, and the neurologists, the biologists, also the non-introspective psychologists all have the second order perspective, the second person perspective. And just recently I found a remark in an old text from Max Planck, who precisely argues that the solution to the heart problem is not, in a sense, a scientific one, but a change of perspective.
Well, it's a metaphysical problem. I think the heart problem is a red herring myself. Chalmers came up with it. People get obsessed with it. It's really, why does awareness exist in the first place? And, all these questions of existence are not answerable by empirical means. We don't know why gravity exists or not. We just know we do have theories about how gravity relates to other things going on in the world, other observables. But science cannot answer why the universe exists or why dark matter exists. It's just that we see the consequences of what we think is a process going on. So I think that it's wrong to demand of science that it's going to answer metaphysical questions of why, and it's important to distinguish and bracket off metaphysical questions from those that can be answered empirically. I use the word correlate because I'm trying to be careful. We don't a priori know that the particular neural patterns cause, say, different qualia, or whether they are in fact what the brain is using to make the discriminations that it does. What we have to do before, the first step in trying to understand relations between things is to look for correlations, and then you manipulate the system in a way that eliminates spurious correlations and common causes and all that. And then when you've done that, you have a much stronger case for what you are observing being causal, that what follows is a necessary concomitant of what happened. I have actually a slide of that at the end. We can talk about it. But
Well,
we have to go for correlation first. We have to crawl before we can walk.
Yes, I agree with the correlations and also with the isomorphic. But this question is, well, you say the why is, after all, a question of causality, which is, of course, more than just correlation.
Yes.
And as I understand it, many brain-mind scientists claim they have resolved this question. They have resolved Cartesian
I'm not going to defend
dualism.
that. I don't think the problem is solved. I think it is solvable. It depends on what level you think. I mean, what level we're talking about solving the problem.
Yeah, you mentioned David.
Okay.
You mentioned David Chalmers, and he had a bet with Christoph Koch 25 years ago. They bet for one case of wine about whether or not this mystery of consciousness can be resolved by neurophysiologists.
Yeah.
So they just concluded the bet, I think in June this year, that Chalmers win because
because they didn't agree. So if you ask a question and it's well posed, then you're clear. Both people, the poser and the person who seeks to answer it, should have a mutual understanding of what would constitute a reasonable answer. So if I say, is it raining outside? You and I could agree that I'm going to go outside and see if I get wet. And if I do, then there's a definite answer to that question. In the case of Chalmers, it was an ill-posed question to say, why does consciousness exist? Without saying it's a metaphysical question, and to claim that it's an empirical question. So I've always thought that it's ill-posed, and many philosophers of mine, like Ned Block, also don't give it a lot of weight, shall we say.
One short comment. According to what you just told us, my feeling is more like we can use analogy of a symphony. A symphony, an orchestra of various different kind of processes going on at the same time, and generate this thing that the whole we hear the whole music. So would you agree
Yeah.
with that kind of analogy?
Well, we're going to get to it. Yeah, I have one. David Eagleman has a drumming metaphor. It's a metaphor, but it's very persuasive. And my students, being performers, love it. So I miss my
Because I think
students.
it leads to the direction of further looking it through in higher and higher resolutions. Yeah, please go ahead. Sorry.
All right. We'll get to it. I hope. Yes, we'll get to it. All right. So the last component of this, is the study of brains. What are the specific material systems that support conscious awareness? As we said, brains are both in regulating the body and they're there for externalized action. So there are things that have to be done in order to have appropriate action. I have been working on, for most of my adult life, for several decades, trying to reverse engineer the brain. What do we need to know to understand how the brain works as an informational system? We need to know the neural codes, which are the signals of the system. We need to know the structure of the hardware, what hardware is available, the neuronal and molecular parts of the system. We need to know what kinds of operations, information processing operations, are available to neurons, of which there are many. They're analog and digital state communication computations. Psychologists study informational functions, what kinds of things that the system needs to do in order to perform some function, some discrimination or detection or classification, as well as goals in the system. How do those work? And then finally, we could have a theory of the brain that would have all this functional stuff, right? We could understand how it works as a functioning information processing machine, but that would still leave out something that's important to us and dear to our hearts, the subjective states that we have. So, a purely physical description doesn't tell you. Let's say in principle we have a predictive theory of what a given brain is going to do as its next state, which neurons are going to fire. That would still leave out what are the phenomenal states? What is the subject of that brain, of which that brain is a part, experiencing? What is that subject experiencing? And likewise, even with all the functional descriptions, we can have functional descriptions that would be complete and adequate of all the things that a given brain could do, but it would leave out the functional states. So this is basically saying the same thing. There are different kinds of models: physical models, functional models, and neurophenomenal models. Brains are, there are lumpers and splitters, people who think that there are two kinds of people in the world, and lumpers, and those who don't, splitters. But if we're trying to reverse engineer the brain, it pays to look at what structures are conserved, to try to understand what the structures do. And they are conserved over large phylogenetic spans, all the way down to primitive vertebrates, chordates. And the basic body plan of the vertebrate nervous system was laid out in a cartoon this is a cartoon sort of thing, a diagram by Willie Nauta in the 60s. This is from Scientific American originally, I think. You have, a spinal cord, midbrain dealing with respiratory functions, thalamus, the striatum, including the basal ganglia, and cortex, hippocampus, which I think which people generally think is an organ of memory, a rebroadcast system for consolidating memories into long-term memory during sleep. And Michael Arbib, who was also coming out of cybernetics tradition in neuroscience, had a similar kind of neurocomputational body plan, where you have different high-level functions, and so we can talk about the kinds of things that are going on in different areas of the brain. These are gross areas of the brain. And my rule of thumb is that the stimulus organizes the tissue. Auditory cortex is auditory cortex because it's getting the correlation patterns that are coming up from the auditory system via the cochlea. The visual system is organized the way that it is, largely because of the structure of visual experience, and so on. And there are experiments where people close their eyes for a week and learn Braille, and it turns out that they recruit areas of their visual cortex in order to learn Braille. There is also basal ganglion striatum, which we think on a first order cut is, and things are always more complicated than this, but it's involved in attentional switching and motor switching, in suppressing those channels and circuits that you're not interested in at the moment in terms of the tasks that you're pursuing, and thereby facilitating the specific circuits that you need to achieve some task. Hippocampus and memory functions. The amygdala is a novelty detector, and the subjective correlate of activation of parts of the amygdala is fear. The hypothalamus involved in internal regulation of the body organs. And the cerebellum can be thought of as a generalized timing mechanism for coordinating all sorts of things. So there is a high-level functional organization of the brain. It's not hopeless. It is challenging sometimes because there's a lot of detail, and it's easy to get lost in the detail, and anatomists often get lost in the detail. Some of them do. And there are locations for these different functionalities that we talked about. So brains can be seen as networks of pattern resonance circuits or loops. They're the rule of thumb is that not every pair of play regions in the cortex are interconnected, but those that are have reciprocal connections. And the work that McCulloch did in the 40s with strychnine neuronography sort of showed that you can disinhibit one region and then look for activity in another. So more recently, people have thought about these loops, and there are recurrent loops that are local. It's part of the visual pathway. There's incoming visual volleys from the eyes and the visual thalamus that come in and go on the dorsal pathway and the ventral pathway. And these are recurrent areas, but also to frontal regions and parietal regions. But in neuroscience, really forever, certainly since Cajal and Lorente Deneau, more than a century ago, people have thought of the brain as a set of recurrent loops. And so the major theories of neural theories of awareness are of several types, and they're not necessarily at odds with each other. But the first type is that there are particular neuronal populations that are the seats of consciousness, shall we say. When you activate those, that's what's necessary and sufficient to get consciousness. People don't think this way much anymore, although Christoph Koch has proposed that maybe the claustrum is a candidate area that's essential for awareness, because if you stimulate it, it can inhibit other areas and shut down other circuits. We could also think that some populations also appear to be more important than others. Does not seem that most of what's going on in our cerebellum we're aware of, per se. We might be aware of subtle effects of what's damage to the cerebellum, but we don't get phosphenes, we don't get percepts when there's electrical stimulation of the cerebellum, as far as I know. I'm not a cerebellar neuroscientist. So there can also be activation of particular neuronal circuits. So people in the 19th century were looking for the highest levels of neuronal integration. Herbert Spencer, Ewing-Jackson, and later Jasper and Penfield. So you could think that there are circuits, some of them involving the reticular formation, which is related to controlling arousal, levels of arousal. Linas proposed thalamocortical circuits. Dehaene and Lame have proposed theories of cortico circuits, and Dan Pollan, who I knew and taught a course on visual awareness at Harvard, thought in terms of anchored loops that are anchored by their location representations in the parietal lobe, so occipital, parietal, frontal circuits. And his papers detail what, if you stimulate here, whether you're going to be aware of it or not, and what would be the neural correlates of that. Tononi has formulated a theory of informational complexity, where awareness ensues when his measure phi exceeds some threshold. And it's related, and not linearly related, I don't think, but to the number of distinctions the system can support in a given mode. So if you're waking, you can think of all sorts of complicated things at the same time and switch between them. If you're asleep, not so much so, and if you're comatose, even less so. So awareness has experiential contents, and hence it has some minimal ability to carry distinctions. And this phi measure can be used as a level of arousal or level of awareness, and like for giving a numerical readout on depth of anesthesia. So the last set of theories, and these are the ones are the best at this point, are neural workspace theories, in which you have recurrent neural activity, neural global workspaces, and one category of those are global coherence theories, where you have correlated coherent activity over large parts of the brain. It's not just fame in the brain, but it's coherent activity in large areas of the brain, in global circuits as well as local circuits. My hypothesis, which I'll outline a little bit, is of this sort. It's a neural global workspace theory, but I think in terms of neural signals and a kind of neural autopoiesis. Forgive me, Maturana, for using that word in a different context. But if we have a signal cell production network, then we have the regeneration of signals and reinforcing signals and mutually inhibiting signals in the manner that is analogous to autopoiesis of material components. So awareness, when and only when global circuits are activated, you get this regenerative signaling, and it permits self-sustaining patterns that stabilize and facilitate local recurrent circuits. That's sort of, those are part of any global workspace theory. In the sleep and anesthesia, global regenerative coherence is disrupted. So a big question in my mind is the relation of neural codes to these global workspaces. Is it the particular neurons involved or self-sustaining nature of the activity patterns that's the key? And that is an open question. This is basically an older slide, but it has many of the same ideas in it. Bernie Bars was arguably the originator of and Stan, I'm blocking on his name, was originator of the global workspace theory in the late 80s, in which you have a system and there can be selective attention that links particular subsystems to the global workspace and facilitates those. So it's very much trying to explain our awareness in terms of attention and which signals and circuits get connected into the global workspace, upon which then those signals get rebroadcast to the rest of the system. And I would say that these kinds of theories are the dominant way that people are thinking in neuroscience-based consciousness studies today. He has some metaphors for consciousness, but those are metaphors to try to explain the global workspaces. It's like a theater stage where there's a spotlight of attention and different modules compete for access, and then when they get access, the attention shifts to them, and the spotlight is on them, and then the whole audience, it's broadcast to the entire audience. So it's a spotlight and broadcast kind of theory. David Eagleman in the series The Brain, which I highly recommend, we use clips from it in my class, has a drumming metaphor where there are drummers who are playing together as a whole. They're listening to the whole ensemble, and they are coordinating their behaviors with that ensemble. Now contrast that with a group of drummers who are playing, who have headphones on or sound protectors on, can't hear each other, and they're playing according to their own beats. There'll be cacophony and a loss of, there won't be global coherence. Now, I want to just stress, I love the idea because it's musical and it's temporal. And that's sort of how I think about signals in the brain as temporal patterns of spiking activity. But it is a metaphor. I'll play just a second of it. I hope that it will come through. Let's see. It's about 2 minutes.
No sound.
So that means who I
Oh,
am
okay.
is not about the existence.
Can you
of
hear it?
neurons,
Yeah,
about what
it's okay now.
they do, how they interact.
Good.
Imagine that the neurons in your brain are like a collection of drummers. If each drummer plays completely independently, the noise that emerges is just that, noise. But if they start listening to one another, something more emerges. Out of cacophony appears a rhythm, a performance, complex interaction in which all the drummers are playing both as individuals and as something greater. And in the same way, this is how the experience of consciousness arises in the brain.
Millions of interacting neurons work in concert.
In
In
concert,
certain
yeah.
circumstances, they hit the sweet spot, the place where the singular, private experience of being you emerges.
Consciousness is a performance our brain puts on for us throughout our day.
Well,
Performance.
you know,
our brain
I
puts
agree
on
with
for
about
us.
95% of what he's saying, but it's not putting on a performance for us being, and we are our brains. We are our brains and our awareness. So he also goes on and talks about what's going on in sleep. And in sleep, the basic way of thinking about sleep is you have local coherence, but not global coherence. The global circuits.
It's impossible for a complex rhythm to emerge from this, which means in this brain state, there's no hope of conscious experience.
So in sleep, all the different regions and recurrent networks are local, and we're not aware of what's going on because we don't have a global working memory that will stabilize those and integrate them and sustain those signals. That would be a way of explaining that. So that's a coherence theory. There is evidence of masking experiments, visual masking experiments by Victor Lam and others, where they look at they present visual stimuli with that mask each other, and they can adjust it so that they have some trials when half the trials the subject is aware of them of some object, and the other half they're not, and they can look at the neural correlates of that, like an EEG or MEG, and determine whether try to infer what's going on in these different areas. And basically, the upshot of all this is that when there's only feed forward activity, there's no conscious percept. When there is localized recurrent processing, there may or may not be a percept. But when you have involvement, recurrent involvement of global circuits, so from the back, the occipital circuits in the occipital lobe in the back that are receiving the visual inputs, and prefrontal areas and the parietal areas, when you have those things being activated and there is recurrent activity, then there is a conscious percept. And so the question is whether it's these loops in particular, or whether it's that you've managed to get the thing to go through a whole cycle so that the threshold of it's self-sustaining once you have one pass through the loop. And what goes on when you have that is that then the loop gains go from sort of slightly negative where the patterns die out to slightly positive where they are self-sustaining and even amplifying. These are slides from my old 2006 poster. So I think of this in terms of loop gains. And in terms of sleep, if you have a transcranial magnetic stimulus, a pulse stimulus, in the wakeful state, there's reverberation that goes on for several hundred milliseconds. If you're in deep sleep, those reverberations damp out. There's an initial response, but then there's no reverberant activity or little reverberant activity that's visible in this in these these kinds of readouts, which are EEG or MEG. Likewise, in anesthesia, if you have the awake condition, you have later reverberations. In the anesthetized case, you don't have the secondary peaks. So and that also relates to Tononi's informational complexity, because having these sustained patterns in this working memory enables more alternative kinds of states. So
How about the dream, Peter?
yeah,
How about the dream in between your
a dream. Well, a dream state is sort of very marginal. I don't normally remember my dreams, but if you're in that state, let's say that you're in a dream state where there's local coherence, and you wake up. The process of waking up is basically those global circuits coming online, and those global circuits then are getting whatever there is in the local areas, and they self-organize to make a coherent story about what was ruminating in those local areas. So I think when I remember my dreams is when I've been dreaming just before I'm awoken. That's my take on it. That would be my take on it. So attention involves the selective application of some of the signal patterns or circuits that are relevant to some task or focus. The system has partial control over which signals dominate in short-term memory and therefore enter awareness. This is contingent on what we are attending to in terms of current goals, but it also can be extraneous things in the environment that occur, that are unexpected, and that can grab our awareness because it's novel. So the amygdala can gain our attention, and we have an auditory startle response, which can wake us up. So it's not completely under our control, but it's largely under control. So we partially control the contents of our minds. So I think of mind-brain combinations, the two are inseparable, are therefore semi-autonomous systems that are organizationally closed but informationally open. And back to this sort of high-level map again. Whatever is in whatever's being regenerated constitutes the contents of our present awareness. And when we close this loop and are able to regenerate the signals, we have a kind of organizational closure. And I think that's why recurrent circuits are recurrent, but why recurrent processes are important, because they allow for sustainable, self-sustaining states. So that's saying the same thing, pretty much saying the same thing. Now, again, I come from another planet. I believe that the signals that are being regenerated are actually complex patterns, temporal spike patterns, rather than which neurons in particular are firing, like neuron 313 and neuron 10,391, or whatever grandmother cells or sparse combinations of neurons. I think it's in the time patterns that are circulating in the system. And I say this because my work in the auditory nerve, when you present a stimulus to the cochlea of an anesthetized animal and you record in the auditory nerve, the first step of neural representations, neural responses, you see that there are time patterns that are driven by the time structure of the stimulus. In fact, this would be the pitch period that you would hear, do, re, mi. And these time patterns and temporal correlations, interspike intervals, give you a very adequate and predictive model of what pitches will be heard, and we can estimate what pitches subjects will hear within about 0.5% of an octave, given about 5,000 spikes in the auditory nerve. So this is a population code. It doesn't depend on which neurons are firing more or less. It depends on the time pattern of the firing. The information is in the signals themselves, in the patterns of firing, and not so much. There is some information which neurons are firing, but it's not so much. And I stress this is at the level of the auditory nerve. I think we don't really understand very well what the neural codes are at the cortical level. That's a problem. But there are possible kinds of neural temporal codes. And the thing that temporal codes allow is that they allow you to multiplex different kinds of signals together in a transparent way. And that means that different kinds of neural networks are possible that are based on principles other than connectionism and firing rates and scalar signals. So if you're interested in that, I have a few papers on timing nets, which I proposed about 20 years ago. So this idea of the autopoiesis of neural signals, we're getting to the end here. It's analogous to autocatalytic networks. It's an autocatalytic network of signals that interfere and reinforce each other. It has parallels to self-production of living organization. And I think that to maintain coherence of the signals may be necessary for their successful regeneration. Also, you need correlated activity. If the regenerative system is based on interacting signals, then when you have correlated signals, they reinforce. When you have uncorrelated signals, they inhibit each other. So that's why random activity, we don't hear the roar of spontaneous random activity in our auditory nerve, even though we have 30,000 nerve fibers that are firing more or less, in a Poisson fashion. When there's no sound, they're firing more or less Poisson-like, randomly, at rates of, averaging, say, 50 spikes per second. Why don't we hear the roar of all that activity? It's because it's uncorrelated. But the minute that there's a stimulus that's organizing all of these, then there are common patterns in the different channels, and they reinforce each other. So a way of thinking about that, and this is from Hebb's 65 book in Reverberating Circuits, is that we have resonant states of signal self-production, and we can switch between those resonant states depending upon which signals come to dominate in those global circuits. Now, there are many parallels to self-production systems in theoretical biology. We think that life is built out of self-sustaining self-production cycles. I think that autopoiesis is by far the best theory of life as an organization, a type of organization. There's a whole family of these things and these ideas of autopoiesis, metabolism repair of Rosen, the self-reproducing systems. I'm thinking von Neumann's kinematic automaton, self-replicating automaton, autocatalytic sets, hypercycles, etc. And if that's the case, then there are different ways of screwing up signal regeneration. And so anesthetics can operate via different means. They can suppress signals. You know, they can lower the level of activity in some neural areas, and then change the loop gains from slightly negative to very negative. They can scramble the signals if you need correlated signals to be able to build up those signals in the global loops. Then scrambling the signals will also do similar things. But this sort of regenerative framework, I think, can explain why ignition and self-sustained activity is necessary for awareness. So just a couple of final observations. All right, so you know, we think that there are global workspaces, you know, and in the vertebrate brain, we see that there are structures that maintain that. You know, and they're conserved over the vertebrate lineages. You know, and so we people in the field tend to think that, you know, maybe all vertebrates and invertebrates as well might be aware. Certainly vertebrates, they have working memories like ours. But what about other animals with nervous systems like cephalopods or invertebrates? Now, it's been thought that cephalopods are conscious. They're intelligent animals. They can do complex things. There was a statement coming out of Cambridge, England, of scientists, a manifesto that octopuses should be considered to be consciously aware. But, you know, do their nervous systems look like they would fit the bill for these global workspaces? Because there are homologies. They don't have cerebellums, apparently, but there are homologies between, you know, cortex and striatum and other regions. And J.Z. Young, who studied the octopus, he's the primo neuroscience scientist of octopuses, of cephalopods, had a reverberating circuit model and thought that there could be short-term memories in the octopus that are analogous to those in vertebrates. So it looks like octopuses might also fit the bill for this theory. But you know, it's a far extension. There are also tunicates, and Rodolfo Linas brought this to my attention. There are animals that have what looks like a fairly normal larval nervous system in the larva with a brain, a head ganglion, in the larval stage where they're free swimming and avoiding predators and finding food, and then they settle down and they attach to a rock and become filter feeders. And once they do that, then they digest about 90% of their nervous systems because they no longer need them, and the only nervous systems that they have left are for regulating the filtering. So this is a case where the animal no longer is motile. It doesn't need to deal with the changing environment. It doesn't need a nervous system. And so Linas proposed that maybe this animal has some awareness, you know, in its larval stage, and then it loses it in the adult stage, which, you know, it's a kind of use it or lose it situation. You don't want to become a couch potato. I'm sure many people of younger generations would think we've already lost our awareness. But all right, so we're at the end of this part. So why don't we have a longer discussion? We can go as long as we want. You know, there are some issues about correlations and where we should go and what kinds of appropriate questions and answers we need to have for our models. But why don't we get to the discussion? So I hope that was fairly clear.
Very comprehensive, overwhelming. exciting.
Yeah, I apologize for.
Thank you so
much.
much. Yes, Jeremy.
Yes, the thing that I heard you say, and it kind of stimulated me to think differently, was that one of the goals is to reverse engineer and construct a consciousness. So that scientists are kind of thinking like that. But there is another way to think, and that can that all depends also a little bit on how one thinks about science. Instead of reverse engineering it and reconstructing it, what about just putting it to work? Like to not say we need to be able to develop it from scratch, but we need to kind of better understand why it doesn't work one way and why it works another way. And that brings me to the question of emotions. So you, on your slide, I did a quick look again, and I didn't see you anywhere kind of saying it's crucially important we understand the relation between the state of being emotional and consciousness. I didn't see that anywhere, but there is a way, if people think about what does consciousness do, then one can connect it with like somehow steering the state of being emotional. And then I can see a whole bunch of interesting implications and ways of continuing the research and continue with the outstanding issues. Okay, so I'm throwing that out there as a question.
Okay. Well, I mean, so I taught courses also on music in the brain, and we dealt with, I didn't have a slide in here, we deal with emotional spaces in the context of music, what musical parameters can engender positive emotions, like happiness versus sadness. So even just things like pitch contours, versus can connote and induce sadness versus happiness. Rising is happy and sad is falling pitches. And so the way that I think of emotions are as a readout of the state of the general state of the organism in terms of kind of major types of response. And the most famous, I guess, is the fight or flight response, which is either which is related to fighting, anger, and flight, fear. You're predisposed to and readying the system to flee. The the space of emotions isn't very well. On one hand, there are these taxonomies of emotion, and we have a pretty good map of what are the different emotions. And there was this well, there's the movie with the cartoon, the characters, representing the different emotional modes. But so that's how I think of it. I don't think that I think that it's part of the contents of consciousness, and not necessarily an enabling state of consciousness. In other words, it doesn't regulate awareness. Although levels of arousal do figure into emotional spaces. So emotions are correlated with levels of arousal. There is an emotion of boredom, which is a low level of arousal, or excitement, which is a high level of arousal. So there are some interrelations with levels of awareness, but not whether you're conscious or unconscious, I think.
Relevant to Jamie's question, how do you say about Heinz von Forster's separation of the electronic processes versus chemical processes? I think he he sort of put it in a particular relationship. It's like the chemical process kind of slow and lost longer time, and kind of setting the mood, including the emotion, I guess. While the electronic processes are quick, it's kind of like
Yeah.
fighting.
Well, synapses are chemical. Some of them are chemically mediated, and some of them are gap junctions that are electrically mediated, that are faster, more precise. But there are different time scales of things that are going on, like neurohormonal modulators. We didn't get into those. There's only so much one can cover in an hour or two. I don't necessarily see an in principle distinction between signals that are chemical in nature from signals that are electrical in nature, although one could make that distinction. And so if you think that neurons are essential for conscious awareness, which is a perfectly reasonable hypothesis, that only with the evolution of nervous systems and neurons do you have awareness. That is one position one could take, and one could point to something like structures that are special to neurons. Someone like Stuart Hameroff might talk about microtubules and processes in microtubules and informational mechanisms of that sort. But that's an open question, and it's
So
a
what
hard
would be
one.
what would be your opinion to Hanson Foster's donut model? The donut model illustrate the two processes going on in the same time, but in different closure. I mean, this electronic signal closure versus the chemical process closure.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the model, so
so that is something we really need to.
I have read a bunch of many of von Forster's papers, and this must have been in the 60s?
I think it's on constructing a reality.
Okay.
On constructing a reality, you can check that donut. It's
I
very
have seen
impressive.
that paper, but I don't remember the model. I mean, if there are multiple processes, those can go on in parallel, or they can interact. Certainly there are regenerative processes in cells, and there are regenerative processes in gene expression, and there can be attractor basins of gene expression that put us into one metabolic state or one epigenetic state versus another, and so there's no fundamental reason. Again, speaking, I consider myself spiritually to be a theoretical biologist. There's no principal distinction between those different mechanisms, albeit that one is can be on a faster time scale than the other. But electrical processes can also be on slow time scales. And, if you have a capacitor that takes seconds to charge up to some threshold, then you have a clock that can deal long time durations. So, there can be chemical clocks, there can be neuronal clocks, there can be neuronal time delays. The timing of spikes can be as precise as fractions of a millisecond. And I think there can be molecular events that are equally precise, either on the single molecule level or you know, an enzymatic action or in ensembles of enzymes.
Okay, if I may ask another question, so it ties a little bit to what I asked about emotions. So if we kind of switched, because you talked about Gestalt switching, I think somewhere, if we switch and if we say, let's do emotions first. So then we say the flight fight of the 19th century, oh, that was a machine. So you push a button and the machine responds. But we're
Yeah.
going to follow George Spencer Brown. And so now I want to get to my question. So if we say this emotions first is a temporal phenomena. Now, when I asked you in the beginning, like, how do you deal with the emergence of consciousness? You said, let's stick to the here and now, where we do the experiments on an adult. But what you're doing is actually you're working with a specific metaphor of temporality. Dus I hear you say the knife edge. I mean, like the here and now is the species present. Dus that's Augustine's knife edge, or that's William James' species present. And so I'm connecting a little bit with Maturana again. But so there are different theories of the here and now. So, Peter, have you given that any thought? So that we really need to look at the philosophy of time.
Yeah,
Also,
of course. Of
yeah,
course.
but that
And,
needs
and
to
the,
be
the
pushed.
here,
Yeah,
the here and
yeah.
now is the contents of those global circuits that are being signals that takes a certain amount of time
Yeah.
for the working memory to fade and to change. So it can change in a fraction of a second.
Yes.
You know, say
There is
elephant.
there is another here and now, and that is the scientist drawing a distinction to communicate with another scientist. And so I'm trying to push more maybe
Sure.
the functional model. Dus the neuroscientists, all the neuroscientists, they're telling stories and they're very good at storytelling and it's very productive. But so what do
Sometimes.
they do? What are the consequences? So if we think in that respect, is there something good that can come out of it? And I know it's a value judgment, but I'm connecting it with emotions.
It's
So
something good.
well, the temporality, bringing in the temporality and the emotions, how that can help us deal with the outstanding issues.
Well, we could have, I mean, you know, so there could be robotic devices that have different behavioral modes. McCulloch and Kilmer in '69, you know, proposed, or Kilmer and McCulloch proposed that there are about 20 different modes that animals engage in that are sort of stereotype behaviors. We could have robotic systems that have those sorts of modes, that have emotional states that prepare them for different kinds of action. You know, and so those would be like our emotional states. Functionally, those would be like our emotional states.
Okay.
Whether they would be aware or not, I mean, that's the question that I want to address. I don't believe that, you know, these informational functions are problematic. We can make robots that sense. We can make robots that have goals, internal goals, and pursue those goals. We can make robots with, you know, short-term and long-term memory. We can make robots with states that are sort of behaviorally like emotional states. But whether they have awareness or not, we would need to structure, I mean, according to this global workspace theory, they would need to have something analogous to a global workspace, which would mean some sort of reverberant memory, perhaps. And I don't think that there are any people working on systems that have that requisite structural organization. that I would think would need to be, you would need to have in order for me to believe that maybe it has some kind of awareness like our own. The Turing test has been a big red herring. I mean, that's just behaviorism and imitation of behavior.
Yes,
That's
but
not the right thing.
I wanna just make a comment, and then Claudia. So you earlier mentioned that the young people don't think we are aware anymore. So
Old
instead of
people, they don't think old people are
yeah,
aware.
but
That was a
that
joke.
is
Of course we are.
no, but that is a very practical question. Maybe we are not aware because there is a conflict going on in the Middle East that just like 10,000 people got killed out of nowhere. And so are our theories of consciousness maybe going in the wrong direction, the way we're thinking about them, that we don't see how useful they can be in terms of making us think about certain problems. And now I will shut up because maybe Claudia has a...
Claudia.
I don't know, Peter, do you want to answer to that provocation about the political consciousness?
Well, I've been a political activist a lot of my life, and of course, what's going on is horrible on all levels. And I've been wrestling with the moral problems that it raises, but I don't think a theory of consciousness is going to solve our political, social problems. I don't have that illusion. I'm not sure what will solve our political, social problems, but and I don't think that it's fair to ask it to solve everything. But I think that it will lead to reverse engineering the brain will lead to new functional principles for building systems that act according to goals, that act in a way that more like humans, and that we can teach them. They can have common sense. They can share the material world that we share, and so they could be better companions, perhaps, and or competitors, perhaps, potentially. But I think we can get that out of it. We can also get a deeper understanding of ourselves. One of the things that I said is that our waking awareness is intimately connected with what's going on in our brains. It's not like our brains made us do it. We are our brains, and we also need to recognize that there are things going on in our subconscious that our conscious awareness is not aware of. We're not aware of that. And so there are all sorts of subliminal prejudices, unexamined assumptions, and all sorts of things of that sort. And knowing that they're out there and that they do and can influence our behavior can mean that we can consciously address those things. So in some ways, I think that self-knowledge can potentially help with dealing with latent prejudices and all sorts of other kinds of beliefs that we might not consciously hold, but are ruminating around in our subconscious.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions because you're working with musicians, with probably, I don't know, you said dancers, performers, musicians.
I was
so
teaching.
In this context, pardon me?
I was teaching there. I'm no longer teaching at Berkeley School of Music.
Yeah, I wondered whether in this context you were addressing questions of creativity. Was that ever coming up in this course, or
I have addressed questions of creativity within percept action loops.
Mm.
And my take on that is that you can have combinatorial creativity where you recombine, you have a set of elements and you can recombine, you can make new combinations of sets of pre-existing elements. Like, you know, the notes of a scale, and you can find new note sequences, shall we say. That's a combinatorial creativity. There's also a creativity in which you create new primitives, qualitatively new dimensions of a system. Like instead of just playing the notes in a particular set of notes, you start playing other timbres, or you go off and you reframe the nature of the music performance, you know, like John Cage did or Marcel Duchamp did for, you know, his urinal art piece. So those are emergent creative kinds of events. And Piaget had, you know, accommodation and assimilation and accommodation, which sort of parallels that combinatoric versus emergent creativity. We didn't talk about creativity so much in this course. There's way too much already, and I'm not sure that creativity is necessary for consciousness or awareness per se. You know, it's nice. It's part of adaptivity, but I don't think that it's sort of orthogonal to awareness per se. You know,
There's this
awareness.
yeah, sorry. There's this, I say, I can't remember in which paper exactly, but Bateson reports on a musical performer, if they're, you know, they're training, and then technically, after a while, I mean, everyone who's playing an instrument, who has trained to play an instrument, or I think the same happens when you do sports. I mean, you can't really. It's kind of thinking. It's not fully aware because somewhat automatic. Are there any explanations for that? You know what I mean? Because you kind of train and
yeah. Then you overtrain and things get automatic and you're no longer really conscious of the details. And that's called an automatism. You know, we have that experience when we're driving or musicians practicing over and over again. They pretty much so you're training up neural circuits. They're taking over those functions. And then all that's needed is to kick those circuits into action. And you can have sort of a monitoring supervisory function. When things go wrong, then you're aware of it and you correct. But by and large, it goes by itself and you get into a sort of flow state where you're no longer trying to consciously manage the details because things are happening too fast really for you to do that. So yeah, so the question there is, it may be the case that in order for the signals to propagate into the global workspace and get attention, there has to be some unexpected behavior. Or Bill Powers would have talked about it in terms of error signals, you know, the difference between expectancy and what happens, an expectancy violation, in other words. And there are automatic processes within the brain, you know, that come under the rubric of what's called mismatch negativity. At every point, we're registering what our immediate expectations are on the basis of the recent context, and computing how novel or unexpected that is. When you have circuits that take care of everything, then those expectancy violations don't occur very often. And so your attention can be elsewhere. and it's no longer on the details of the circuit that's doing the performance. But it's sort of floating and intervening wherever necessary. I mean, that would be my take on that.
Yeah, very
Um,
interesting. Thank you.
But, you know, there are lots of questions about, you know, why aren't we conscious of what's in our cerebellum, or, you know, when you have these automatisms and neural networks that are set up to do these things, is there local consciousness in those networks? Are they recurrent? Are they regenerating their signals, you know? And it's problematic to try to answer those questions. It's also the question of panpsychism. How do you know whether the components themselves are conscious and you're just recombining the awareness of components when you link them together in a global circuit? How do you distinguish that from some sort of emergent organization in which awareness suddenly arises almost de novo? And I don't have settled answers for those things.
But Peter, I know you are probably hungry and tired, but
Sure, we can.
can you bring us? Browse the rest of your slides. I think
Sure.
I have another 10 or so there. So just to give us a full records of your excellent work.
Sure. Well, thank you. Sure, I'll make a PDF and you guys can look at it and
Yeah.
and ruminate about it, and you know, and I'm happy to have another conversation about it if you ever want to.
Okay, so we will generate more questions, and maybe you can do the session 2.
And I think in about a week or 10 days we're having another discussion with Boris.
Yeah. A number of people has to leave earlier. They say highly appreciated, bravo, things like that in the chat box.
Oh, all right. Well, thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you very
guys.
much.
Yes.